Okay, so we're going to look at one more frame this week, and that's the human resource frame. Again, we're looking at our book, Reframing Organizations by Bowman and Deal. Remember that their human resource frame thinks about things from a social psychological perspective. It talks about the individual and the human side of things, which I think in some ways, if you're a ministry type, this is something that you probably resonate with, right? The structural frame, maybe it isn't instinctual, though there's some advantages and disadvantages to that, but I think it's the same with the human resource frame as well. So here's the assumptions in the human resource frame. Organizations exist to serve human needs. So it sort of starts with people, right? People and organizations need each other. That's an assumption. When the fit between individual and system is poor, one or both suffer, right? So there's ways that the human resource frame is trying to think about actually like the health of the individual. And a good fit benefits both. So when a person's thriving, the organization is thriving. Human resource frame, right? Now, you've probably seen this before in maybe a college class or something like that. I think the human resource frame thinks deeply about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you remember, Maslow says there's sort of different levels, right? You have the sort of the physiological needs, which are basic: food, water, relationship, basically just taking care of oneself. Then there's safety, like does a person feel safe? Then there's love and belonging, friendship, family, sexual intimacy, esteem, like confidence in who I am, and then self-actualization. This is where I'm trying to be creative and spontaneous and everything else. I need the lower needs met in order for me to actually pay attention to the higher needs. And I think this becomes really, really important when we think about things from a human resource frame. If I'm dying on the inside, if I don't feel safe, if I'm barely making it, if I'm getting paid $1.98 an hour and I'm trying to do 3 other jobs in order to do ministry, it's really hard for me to be creative. It's really hard for me to dream cool dreams about what ministry is going to be, because there are just basic needs that are not being met that I need to address first. So the human resource frame calls that out and says we need to think about like the basic needs of people to make sure that they're prepared to actually be able to achieve the higher thinking and excitement that comes with that, which also is really important, right? Self-actualization is just not a product. It actually gives life to the person as well. Now, McGregor has a theory of X and Y as well. And what is interesting about this theory is that what they're basically saying is like the way that leaders or managers think about the people that are serving with and under their care can actually affect their management style, right? Now we can think about this with people that are that maybe work for us or our volunteers as well, right? And he talks about these different spheres: attitude, direction, responsibility, motivation, and creativity. Okay. Now, Theory X says, like, if I think that my workers or my volunteers' attitudes are like they don't like what they do, they find it boring, they're gonna just avoid it when they can, then I will manage in a particular way. Same with direction, responsibility, motivation, and creativity. Like, we might assume that we got to force them into compliance, or they're just not going to do their job, or they need to be directed and told exactly what to do, because otherwise they're going to just avoid responsibility. Or if I don't like stay on them and like threaten them or take something away from them, they're not going to do their jobs. And there's little creativity except when getting around the rules, right? So we need rules to make sure that they don't diverge from what we're trying to do, because they're always up to something, right? So that would be a way to think about it. Now, Theory Y says a bit of the opposite, right? There's the assumption that like my team needs to enjoy what they do. They actually are very can be self-directed if I give them a clear goal of where they're going. They thrive on responsibility, so I'm going to try to give that to them. They're motivated by self-development and contributing to the world. Like, they actually think that what they do matters, and I want them to remind them of that. I think that they can be creative if I give them the opportunity to do that. Now, what's interesting, what McGregor says this, is that the views that we have about how we lead people actually turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I can actually signal to the people that I work with the values and what I think of them, and then they begin to actually live that. So if I treat someone with suspicion and thinking that they're always trying to get around the rules, they actually will start acting that way. If I treat people with a sense like you actually want to do something that matters in the world, then they're going to start acting that way. And I think that that's really, really important for us to understand. I just texted a leader that I was working with this last weekend, and I just said to them, I said, I love what you're doing. Your community needs you. Keep leaning into that, right? Because I think what we want to do is call the best out in people, and that can make a difference. I think if we're not careful in churches sometimes, I think we can really communicate both theory X and theory Y to our teams, our volunteers, our parishioners in such a way that they actually begin to act that way. So sometimes we blame maybe the people that we're leading for their behaviors, but perhaps from a human resource frame, we can kind of say, well, what am I communicating to them? What's like the underlying narrative or message that I'm offering to them? Am I contributing to the way that they're acting because they're responding to the way I'm treating them, right? That's human resource frame for us to think about. And then, Agiris talks about this idea of personality and organization. Traditional management principles produce conflict between people and organization. Task specialization produces narrow, boring jobs that require few skills. And directive leadership makes workers dependent and treats them like children. So what can happen, according to Agiris, is this idea that if we treat them that way, they will actually, as we said before, what McGregor said, they will act that way, right? So we have to be careful with the structural frame, according to human resource frame thinkers, of not turning people into simply cogs in a machine that get in trouble when they diverge. That there's more to a person than that. They need that in order to thrive in personally and for the organization to thrive. So he also says this, Agiris says this, is that workers adapt to frustration in several ways, okay? And we begin to see this as well, right? They withdraw. They just maybe don't show up as much, right? They become passive or apathetic. They resist top-down control through deception, sabotage, hierarchy. They form groups such as labor unions. They train children to behave where that work is unrewarding. So you can see what begins to happen is that if we're not careful, people in the organizations will find ways to cope with the things that they find really, really frustrating to them. Now, a structural frame would be like, well, they just need more clarity. A human resource frame says they just need more life, right? And this are things that we can think about. So we can improve human resource management by building and improving human resource philosophy, hiring the right people. Think about how we do that. How do we keep the right employees? How do we invest in our employees? How do we empower employees? How do we promote diversity within our communities so that there's this sense of creativity and collectiveness that comes with that? And I think, again, this is really important as we think about like churches and ministry as well. Like, we don't just hire or bring a volunteer on to just like do a thing, right? I think sometimes we think of delegation as giving people the things that we don't want to do. That's kind of like a structural frame. Like, I don't want to do that. You do that, right? I'm going to divide the labor up and I can focus on other things. At some level, that might be okay. But from a human resource frame, we've got to say, like, what gives you life? What are the gifts that God's given you? How might you volunteering make you a better person? Like, human resource frames begin to ask these type of questions. So what else? Well, I think when we think about from a human resource frame, we can think about the fact that groups are always operating at two levels. There's the task and there's the process. There's the dealing with interpersonal conflict in a group setting. And I think from a human resource, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we trying to accomplish? But how are we trying to accomplish it together? Okay. The goal from a human resource frame is not just to achieve the goal. That's more of a structural frame. The human resource frame says, how are we all going to achieve that goal together? When there's conflict, can we agree on the basics? Can we search for common interests and things in common? Can we experiment? Can we doubt our own infallibility? Like, I could be wrong. Like, is there openness to that? Can we treat differences as group responsibilities, right? Part of the human resource frame calls into action not only the thriving of the individual, but the thriving of the whole person. You'll see this as we continue to read Sticky Faith Innovation, that one of the challenges that comes with creativity is not just coming up with creative ideas. It's actually how we come up with creative ideas together, or oftentimes some of the tensions of the group begin to come out because we're forced to collaborate and think about things together that requires a negotiation with each other, and trust with each other, and grace toward each other. So creativity in the end is not just coming up with a cool idea, it's actually becoming an innovative team that is learning to work together. Now, there's strategies that we can do with the human resource frame. We can improve advocacy by making your own process, thinking process visible. I do this a lot with my colleagues, even at Fuller. Like, we kind of say, hey, this is the reason I assume this, but let me explain to you kind of where I'm coming from, right? That allows me to talk about my process and what's going on inside, rather than just fighting over maybe the solution that I came up with. There's strategies for improved inquiry, right? Ask others to make their thinking process available. Well, how did you get to that solution? What are your assumptions? Tell me a little bit more how you got there. I'm really interested, right? This again allows us to honor the person's process, not just their decision. We can do strategies for facing point of view with where you just disagree. Seek to understand, share concern, offer alternatives, right? In a human resource frame, we leave room for that. And there's strategies when you come to an impasse, like, again, starting with where you agree. Like, we don't want to get to the point where we basically have two sides fighting against each other and then the thing blowing up. We have to kind of step back and kind of say, okay, wait a minute, we're in this together. The decision is important, but us getting to that decision together is important, and we will do the work that needs to be done for that to happen. Now, as you can tell, like, a human resource frame isn't always that efficient. Like, it makes you perhaps reimagine your timeline for a project, the way you use your meetings. Like, if we only operate from a structural frame, it becomes so efficient that we can be so focused on the task that we don't realize that we're trying to bring people along, and we'll look to work and grow together as a team. So think about that from a human resource frame as you work with your volunteers or your teams. Like, how do you set up a meeting in such a way where there's time to process, there's time to know each other, there's time to make decisions within the realm of those sort of conversations? That makes all the difference from a human resource frame that we need to think of mind. So when it comes to this chart that we're building, we talked about the structural frame last time. The metaphor for a human resource frame is family. Okay. I'm hot and cold on family when it comes to churches. I know that there's the family of God and we can use it theologically. I think sometimes family can be used as an excuse to circumvent maybe the structural frame, right? Like, well, we're family, right? Well, that's true. And you're also hired. So we don't hire family members. We can be a family, but from a structural frame, there's also hierarchy and accountability. So don't pull the family thing on me when we're talking about my salary, right? Don't pull the family thing on me when we can't confront inappropriate behavior or not meeting learning objectives either. So the family metaphor is great for the human resource frame, but there are limitations to that as well. The concept here is focusing on needs, skills, and relationships. The leadership image here is how a leader empowers somebody. And the basic challenge is aligning organization and human need, right? There is human needs that we have, but there's also a mission that we have with our organization that we have to think about. So sometimes I think that younger leaders can flip this, like, why doesn't the organization like provide everything for me so that I can thrive? The reality is that an organization can't. There are things that a person and a leader and an organization can agree on where there's thriving for both the organization and the younger leader. But there are things that the younger leader are going to just have to find outside the organization as well. So there are some limitations associated with that as well. So how can you use this frame to help your youth ministry? Think about the people that you work with. Think about your volunteers. What do they need from you as you think about developing your ministry? What's this frame's limitations? Where if perhaps you overplayed this frame at the expense of maybe the structural frame that needs consideration, and what's expected of youth leaders from this frame? What are we calling them into? I'm going to talk more about this when we talk about our volunteer arc later, but more is expected than them just showing up and giving an hour of their time. I actually think we're asking more of them, and for their benefit and for the benefit of the community as well. I'll let you know about that in a second. So for some self-questions here. From a human resource frame, where are people supported and where do they need support? Where do you think you're doing a great job with that, and where are there limitations? How might you apply the human resource frame to your youth ministry staff or volunteers? Are they empowered? Are they thriving? How are your meetings going? Think about those things. And then from a human resource frame, how do you experience your job and role? Do you feel like you're thriving? Do you feel like you're empowered? Where do you feel that and where don't you, right? This frame allows us to think about that as well. So the human resource frame. And with that in mind, let me leave you with this as we wrap up this week. My friends, may you know the importance of your role. May this thinking of the structural and human resource frame open you up to maybe some of the checks that you've had in your own spirit about your role. May it give you language to understand what's going on. And may these frames also allow you to advocate for your team, for your volunteers, and for your young people in new ways. And most of all, may this week you know God's grace and peace.